All right, with that, I would love to introduce our guest today. Frank, I should have asked you how to pronounce your last name, Frank. Grijalva?
Grijalva.
Grijalva,
Yeah.
thank you. Frank has worked with the International Trauma Center since 1999 and deployed Ground Zero to manage a team of clinicians working with a federal agency in the dig to stabilize them ongoing as they did that difficult work. He's also worked extensively throughout Louisiana and Mississippi in the aftermath of Katrina. Through the International Trauma Center, Frank has worked abroad in Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank, Nepal and Jordan, Haiti, and several other countries for agencies like Save the Children, USAID, and the World Bank, and the International Center for Protection of Victims of Torture to learn interventions in complex situations and train them, as well as be trained by clinicians from all over the world with children and families. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. The title of this talk is A Journey of Post-Traumatic Growth, and I have to find how to stop sharing. And I'm really honored, Frank, that you are here with us today, and you can share your screen and we can get started. So thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. Again, my name's Frank Grijalva. I direct Midwest Trauma Services Network. I'm also a Senior VP for the International Trauma Center out of Boston. And I'm a kid that went through it. I'll be using this framework to kind of detail the story that I'll tell, and then what we've learned. I was taken from my mom at the age of 2 in 1959. At that time, California and a couple of other states were really aggressive about taking kids out of single mom households and putting them into nuclear families. The family that I got taken by and adopted by adopted me to raise a priest for the Catholic Church. That was going to be my job, my role. And there was a lot of challenge in the home. My adopted dad had PTSD from the Korean War and was an alcoholic. And my adopted mom had pretty significant mental health issues. And I was a very kinetic kid. So there was a lot of time spent trying to restrain me, to stop me, to slow me down, to, figure out how to get my energy, take care of my energy. So it was a brutal home, both physically and emotionally abusive. Once I started doing my own work, my own healing work, I was able to identify at least 2 instances where I, was outside of myself, watching myself being abused. So the idea of PTSD, the idea of childhood PTSD, became my diagnosis around the age of 40. We moved all the time. I went to 9 different schools in the first 9 years of life. So my relationship with peers was always in the beginning or in the ending. There was no development of robust relationships with peers. That type of conditioning that comes around being around the same kids all the time that we take for granted. A lot of shame and a lot of trying to fit in without really knowing how, with fear and shame being the way that my brain had been built in the environment I was being raised in. So, when you have a brain that's being fear built, only certain parts of the brain get stimulated, as we know now from the decade of the brain, the science that has come out of the fMRI studies now, and they've done longitudinal studies, and we could see what happens to the memory structures in the brain, what happens to the left hemisphere related to comprehension and verbalization and linear and logical thinking. Those don't get stimulated when you live in an environment of fear and threat. the part of the brain that's being activated and being elegantly built to survive is the right hemisphere, and the limbic system, the idea that you can react and adapt in the moment, but you never contemplate the future except through the lens of fear. So, now the science is pretty clear. As kids come into school that come from challenging homes and challenging environments, that they're missing a lot of stimulation, a lot of neural networking in that part of the brain related to what's being required in a school setting: linear and logical thinking, comprehension, and verbalization. And it's not the fault of the kid, right? It's not the child's fault that they had to endure, exist in a survival environment or a challenging environment that required them to pay attention in a particular way. And yet, what do we do with kids who don't test well going into the school setting? We label them. And with the labeling comes the micro cues and the microaggressions of the adults or the other kids, because now that kid has that label, whether it's SPED or behavioral or a mental health, right? We're not aware of how much our whole posture, the micro cues in our face change as we engage children who have been labeled. Our unconditional bias comes into play. So I made it through school. I slept through high school because at that time I was in the streets pretty much. Because I had been built in a fear-based environment, my central nervous system was set to a high level of tension. I needed tension, and there was no tension in a school setting unless I created it. And I did create it. I was a torment to many of my teachers, especially if I didn't like them. I was very good at getting under their skin and triggering them. And it was the only power I had in the world. So, if I was, in school, and once I hit sixth grade and I got kicked out of Catholic school, which shifted my whole sense of who I was in this home that I was in. And now I'm in the streets. I'm hanging with kids in the East Bay of Oakland and Martinez and Richmond. And if you know that East Bay area, running around during the 60s and early 70s and getting into a lot of trouble because I was attracted to risk. I needed tension in order to be present, to be alive. And so I found my way into a lot of trouble. I survived it. I survived my way into my post-adolescence, 20 years old, 21 years old. And I was running around with a group of young men who all had kind of the same lived experience. And then we started dying when we hit 21. I lost 3 friends in a very short period of time. And I had enough sense, and I had an older mentor somewhere say to me, "Hey, you can see what's going on, right? You can see what's happening. You need to get out of here." And so, I remember the epiphany which started my journey was waking up or coming to consciousness or mindfulness in the back of a Dodge Charger 440 Magnum at 140 miles an hour on a dirt levee road. We're at the Sacramento River on one side and 100-year-old walnut trees on the other side. And I'm not driving. Somebody else is in control. I remember being in a cold sweat. It only takes one little problem and this is all over. So I went down and enlisted in the Navy because I wanted to be, I was a good swimmer, which is how I survived my high school years. I was seen as a good swimmer. So there was some esteem in that. There was some nurturing in that. And as I went into the U.S. Navy and wanted to be a diver, I took the ASVAB. And for the first time, became aware that I had aptitude. I scored very high on the ASVAB, which was totally not the way I perceived myself. And they told me I was going to be a nuclear submarine tech. And I was like, yeah, I slept through high school. I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be a nuclear submarine tech. And so they said, well, what do you want to be? And I said, well, I want to be a Navy diver. And they said, well, if you're going to be a Navy diver, you're going to be an EOD diver. And I'm like, EOD diver? I go, what's that? And they said, well, it's explosive ordnance disposal. And of course, with my need for tension, I was like, okay, I'm all in for that, right? That's right up my alley. I'm in. So I went into the Navy and jumped through all the hoops, went through boot camp well, went through my technical school well. And then I went to combat dive school down in Coronado, California, on the amphib base down there. And I saw some people are here from San Diego. And I graduated and got my choice of orders. So one set of orders was to go to Keflavik, Iceland, to be with a isolated duty EOD team, and the other was right down the street at the amphib base with a unit that I didn't know anything about or hadn't heard about. So but it said Marine Mammal Program, and I'm like, Marine Mammal Program, that sounds interesting. So I said, I'll take those orders. So I reported to duty, and I stepped into a world that began teaching me for the next 8 years. And the Marine Mammal Program in the Navy was at the time run by SEAL Team. So it was a SEAL Team unit, and we worked with dolphins and beluga whales and sea lions that worked in partnership with the Navy SEAL Team guys to protect our forces, to protect our waterways, to protect our people. And for those of you who, love animals and know that the Navy took very, very good care of their dolphins and belugas and sea lions. And they were monitored by the Marine Mammal Protection Act as well. So there's a lot of oversight. The animals were in far less danger than the divers were. And they were very well taken care of. And all of the training was from a positive reinforcement perspective. So you had to build relationship, and you could only use positive reinforcement tactics because you're working with an animal in the open ocean. So they don't like what you're doing, they take off. And if they're gone for a couple of days, you're in trouble. And yet, we never lost an animal in that way because they were the attachment process and the pod process was so intact and really well done. And I got there and I started working in this unit. And of course, I'm a combat diver. I'm not a SEAL team guy. I'm the first non-SEAL team guy in this unit. So I had to pay my dues, as you do in these types of environments. And it took me about a year before I, was able to start to handle my own animal. And yet, the way that I had been built was as a chameleon in my environment. So everything that I'd done had been me adapting in the moment without thinking about the consequences, without understanding building and becoming masterful at anything specific except for swimming. And so I was a chameleon. I was not a present, fully intact human being. And the dolphins couldn't see me. I was not coherent as a human being. And so the idea of matching, of being able to, for a pod animal, which is highly attuned to micro cues and to working in a secure attachment, if you're not presenting fully authentically present, then, you're not going to get much engagement. And so I had to learn how to become authentic and present, because who doesn't want to work with dolphins, right? So the motivation, the internal motivation to be in relationship with this animal or these animals and to be able to have this, really special type of interaction, it began my journey of emergence into being mindful and being present. And in addition, I learned about behavior modification. So if a behavior is this and you want to get it to this other thing, what is the sequence? How do you shade, shape, capture behavior? All through a positive reinforcement lens, right? All through relationship. There is no other way. Because and for me, this translates into human interaction in which it defies what we get taught as we're growing up and what our system provides for us in way too many parts of the world that we work in. Our system and the way that we grew up were coercion based. It was punishment, consequence based. So that's the scaffolding we have for how we, engage people and try to modify their behavior. And it's reinforced by a system that uses those same tools, right? You have 30 days to complete this, or, if you don't show up, then you can't come back, right? There's all of these different ways that challenge a human being. And if the human being doesn't have relationship, then they can't step into that vulnerability of being shamed, of being rejected, of being abandoned, of being consequenced again. So the learning, I got to work longer in the marine mammal unit than, 99% of people who work in that program, because it's a 2-year program. I kept finagling another 2 years and then another 2 years in order to stay in that environment. And then at the end of 8 years, they weren't going to let me do it anymore. So I'm like, well, why would I want to do anything else in the military? I'm out of here. So I left and I pursued other interests. And at the age of 32, I was living in LA and I had my head down and I was just trying to survive. And I get a call from my brother who's 10 months younger than me. And he's looking for me, but I'm kind of off the map. So I call a buddy of mine to tell him I'm going to come home back up to Northern California for the county fair. And he says, have you talked to your brother Ted? And I'm like, no. And he's like, he's been looking for you for 3 months. I'll give you, I'm going to hang up and he's going to call you. So my brother, who I grew up with, who's from my family, who's 10 months younger than me, he calls me right away and he says, you need to sit down. And I'm like, why? And he goes, I found our family. And I was too sensitive. I was so afraid that we would be rejected if we found our family that I let him handle it. I could not have tolerated finding the family and finding out that we were just not meant to be, that it was all a big mistake. But he was gung-ho for it. So he found the family and he's talking to me and he goes, dude, he goes, you're not going to believe this. He goes, they've been looking for us for 30 years. He goes, you're the oldest. He goes, you're junior. You're you're the head of our generation of the family. And I met him 3 months ago and they can't wait for you to come home. Now, this for me is rocking my world. It's surreal. I mean, the work that I was doing in LA, I'd have to pull over to the side of the freeway and just sit for 20 minutes because it was such an overwhelming thing to do. And so about 3 or 4 weeks later, the next thing I know, I'm back up there and I'm meeting this very large family in the East Bay around Pittsburgh and Antioch, California. And my grandmother sits me down alone, even in the middle of this big party, and she says, you're going to come live with me. And I'm like, yeah, I'm 32. I've been on my own since I'm 16. I'm pretty sure I'm not going to come live with you. And she goes, no, you don't understand. You're part of this family now. You're going to come live with me. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not convinced I'm going to come live with you. And then all my aunts and uncles gathered around me and, ganged up on me and said, no, you don't get it. You're the oldest. You're part of the family now. You have to come home. It was so 6 weeks later, I'm living with my grandmother in her little house that is, it's modest. It's out in the, sticks, out in the orchard. And for the first time in my life, I experienced unconditional love for 3 months. And she owned a Mexican restaurant. She turned it over to the kids and stayed home with me. And I slept in till noon. When I got up, there were fresh homemade tortillas and carne asada and chili verde and chili Colorado made for me every day. And my cousins would come over to meet me, and she would be like, no, leave him alone. And then she would tell me stories of the family. So over the 3 months, she just loaded me up with this thing that I'd never experienced before, this profound thing. And so I was, it was overwhelming. And as I settled into it and got to know the family, I hit there was this next notch of learning that occurred for me, this thing that I had never known before, that now I have a sense of, but I'm an infant, I'm a babe in this relationship with, unconditional love, unconditional regard. So, a couple years go by, I get married because I'm, jumping through the hoops, but I don't know what I don't know still. I'm still emerging as a human being, and I'm supposed to get married. And having affection for somebody and thinking it's the right thing, but not knowing what I don't know until the birth of my son. And he's 3 months old, and I'm over the top of him, looking down in his eyes. And I just remember like vertigo. I'm like falling. I'm falling into his eyes. And I was bewildered. I had never experienced this. And now I know it's oxytocin, that deepest connection. And it was so uncomfortable and it was so scary. It was this place that emotionally I had never been before. And so I began to get curious, and I ended up, being a stay-at-home dad for my children. And I was not the best dad for the first 3, 4 years of life because my trauma history would come up. So even though I had all this behavioral conditioning, which allowed me to be aware of myself in the way that I was presenting, because dolphins are so tuned into micro cues and microaggressions that you had to constantly monitor your posture and facial expression and movement. I had training so that I knew I knew what I looked like. And I was able to stop myself after a couple of seconds, but I'd already done damage. I was menacing. I was out of my head. My past was in their face. And just that overwhelming, menacing aggression that, children shouldn't have to see. And so as I became aware of it, I became deeply ashamed but bewildered. Where is this coming from? how am I not able to control myself with a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old? And that bewilderment began my academic journey. I wanted to know what was going on. So child development and trauma, I got my undergraduate degree in disaster psychology. I got a master's in public health with a focus on child mental health. I got a clinical master's with a focus on traumatology. I went to school for 14 years, all the time being in environments where kids were struggling, where human beings were struggling, and learning from a range of clinicians, from a range of faith-based, whether it was the shamans or whether it was community leaders or faith-based leaders, what is the architecture of creating a path so that somebody can make a healing journey. And as we know from, I'll go to as we know from the ACEs study, that pyramid on the left, right, that way too many more people experiencing challenge than we had previously thought about before the 90s, right? We hadn't considered it. Now we had the data, and we knew that, there was this sequence of things, that there was a high correlation, that if you had these challenges in your home and you had a lot of them, that you were likely to struggle physically and emotionally, maybe with mental health issues or with physical health issues. So as the science came out in the 90s, like the decade of the brain was the 90s. So we built machines, and we're able to start doing longitudinal studies into the 20s. And we discovered, mapped the genome in the 90s. And we're able to see that there was this other thing that we didn't know about called epigenetics, that our genes will, express depending on what's going on in the environment. And, that in addition to the ACEs study, and then Sandra Bloom's work around organizational trauma and the idea that American society is traumatogenic, that it's actually built based on, trauma, the coercion, the restraint, the isolation, the seclusion. What we in this world, in the environment that I'm in, would call, the colonizer mindset of using suppression in order to manage behavior. And then I look at our school systems and I see the same thing, control, right? Where is the internal motivation for a child? If there's constant suppression and there's constant consequence of behavior, there's no attachment, there's no relationship. And so for me, what this goes back to is this idea, we look at this pyramid on the right, we have the generational embodiment and the historical trauma, the social condition, the local context, even before a child is born. It's what the adults are living in. And it is having an impact on their genetic expression, the shortening of fuses on specific genes that will express earlier in life, depending on how challenging the environment is. And now that gets passed down to the child even before conception. So now you have a child who is primed and has this accelerated movement into the physical world where they have more demands. And what they need most is a quiet, calming, loving environment for long enough so that they can begin to contemplate and to experience, what we know from Ed Tronick's, still face experiment, what we know from Beatrice Beebe's work, simultaneous MOMDIV, that the primary caregiver is coaching the infant into secure attachment, into being esteemed. And that lays the foundation then for the ability to have empathy and to manage affect and to take other perspective. Those core 5 things that a human being needs to have as a solid foundation that the house gets built on, the house of living gets built on. And yet we don't know what we don't know. And when we're overwhelmed by a system that puts all of these challenges on us, as providers of people who are taking care of other people, frustration, being, not having enough resourcing around us, not understanding the sequence of resourcing, right? So one of the things that I did when my kids were young is I became a coach, a swim coach for a age group team, because swimming was how I, knew how to be masterful. And we had a really good team. And we had a lot of great kids. But for me, it was the kids who were coming in who struggled. Those kids who, couldn't manage their affect or couldn't pay attention. Those kids, giving them that rhythm and giving them that tempo and giving them this space where they can be esteemed, maybe for the first time in their lives. Being able to experience this thing with enough repetition that it became comfortable. So I want to make sure I get to this because it's so important, and I don't want I want to overemphasize this, if anything. There is a process. There's a sequencing. And the way that I learned about it and it applied it in a formal way in the way that I do my work was I read this book called Thinking Slow and Fast by Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2002, and he was he was a psychologist. And so how did they use advertising in order to influence behavior? So understanding that in this book of all of the different ways that they used advertising to get us to be primed to consume, that there was a formula. And for me, the formula jumped out. And so I'm going to give you guys the formula. It takes 11 repetitions on average. That's the center of the bell curve in order to create familiarity with a new concept. 11 repetitions. So if you see something 11 times, by the 11th time with enough frequency, you go, oh yeah, I know what this is, right? Which changes the neurochemical architecture of your bloodstream. You go from grinding on it, thinking slow about it, and trying to figure out what it means in the context of your life, to now you're, oh yeah, I know what this is. So now, there's a shift in your physiology in relationship to it. And an example I'll use, and, I know there's some people on here who have heard me speak before, so you'll recognize this example, but the example I always use is Coca-Cola and Christmas. When I say Coca-Cola and Christmas, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you? Now, most people will say polar bears, right? Why do you need to know that information? It has no utility for you. Why is it in your head, right? So know that Coca-Cola was not selling Coke during the winter. So they designed a Coke campaign where they used operant and classical conditioning. So they took a neutral stimulus, which was Coke, and they put a positive stimulus, a cute baby polar bear sliding down a slide, drinking a Coke, right? And then they showed it to you with enough repetition to where at some point, a large chunk of people went, oh, this is the one with that cute baby polar bear slide down slide. I love this one. So now you have a positive affiliative relationship with this thing. It's in your mind, and it goes into fast thinking, which means it goes into unconscious bias. You have a bias now. And then they prime you as you go into the grocery store. As you all know, Coke and Pepsi fight for the middle shelves on the soda pop aisle, so that you're at eye level when you see it and get primed to buy their product. So what does that mean? So what that means is once you have pulled Coke off the shelf between 20 and 40 times, you now have a motor cortex synapses built. So your body knows how to go through the motions. With enough repetition, with enough reward, after you have that built, then you unconsciously just grab Coke. So now you're conditioned. There's this conditioning effect. So 11 repetitions is the center of the bell curve. 20 to 40 repetitions of engagement begins to build a synapse. And then once you have enough repetition with it, it goes into unconsciousness. Now, this is also true for behavior, danger behavior. I want you to think about your drive to work. How many of you have been driving to work the same way for, a year, right? You don't even think about the drive to work anymore. The next thing you know, you're in the parking lot going, how did I get here? So now you've taken something that's very dangerous and you've done it with enough repetition that you go on automatic pilot when you're driving, you start thinking about other things. But if you were to become conscious to the idea that you're right next to a 18-wheeler doing 65 miles an hour, and what the potential of that is, that would, give you a little snap of awareness, right? And we get those on our drives to work because somebody will cut us off, or, somebody will run a stoplight or whatever it happens to be. And we'll get that secondary, we'll get that reminder for just a few seconds, but then we'll drop right back into automatic pilot. We'll drop right back into unconscious behavior. So I say all of this because we now know that about 85% of our behavior is unconscious. We don't know we're doing it. We're not aware that we're doing it. And this is true for kids who come from struggling homes and parents who come from struggling homes. They're not aware that they're engaged in this behavior, and they're going to be resentful for you to bring it up unless you have relationship. Once you have relationship, then you can begin the process of starting to plant some seeds around, maybe this isn't working for you so well. But sometimes we don't have time. So we try to put the cart before the horse. We're trying to extract behavior out of them without having built relationship. And many people struggle with relationship anyway. The idea that they can trust and be connected. And yet I'm here to tell you there's no other way. You have to take the time to be consistent and predictable and build relationship. Now, I use the first 3 core actions of psychological first aid all the time because they are exactly what is necessary in order to begin to create a sense of consistency and predictability in your behavior in relationship to a client. And those are, first of all, they know who you are. Core action 2 is safety and comfort, safety and comfort, safety and comfort. When you do that with enough repetition, guess what your client knows? That when you walk through the door, you're going to provide safety and comfort. And then they're able to distinguish you from that system that they may have an adversarial relationship with, or a bias that triggers them into an unconscious bias as they engage you. So there's this, you have to, when you build safety and comfort with enough repetition, and then you get to information gathering or to stabilization, whichever is necessary for that next step, you now have a foot in the door. So what does that look like? So I've been working here in the Tulalip tribes now for 10 years, and I go into the schools, and I go into the schools, and the kids, that I work with in the schools, I may walk into a group of them and I'll say, my safety and comfort is, hey, it's good to see you guys. I'm going to be here, for the next few hours. Let me know if you need anything. That's my drop over and over and over again. Let me know what you need. Let me know what you need. Let me know what you need. By the 10th or 11th time, they know what I'm going to ask, but they have many shields. They have lots of shielding. They're behind layers of defensive strategy that they've learned to protect themselves. So now 11th time comes, no response. They're still ignoring me. 25th time comes, no response. They're still ignoring me. 26th time comes, I come in. Hey, I'm going to be in the building. I'm going to be around for the next 3 or 4 hours. Let me know what you need. The response then, you are a creepy old white dude. Get out of my face. So now I get the defensive response, right? But what this means for me is I don't take things personally. Their defensive response doesn't have anything to do with me. It has to do with their lived experience. For me, I have gotten through layer one and I can't take it personally. So my response is to laugh. Okay, I get it. I understand, but know that I'm going to be here anyway. I'm not going anywhere, right? And I may have some resources that are useful to you. Now it may take another 10 repetitions. And then the response is, well, I need a new bike. Can you do that for me? Now you get into boundary setting. The idea that you can say, okay, well, here's what I can and cannot do, right? I think we might be able to find that resource for you, but I can't do that personally. So you're setting boundaries, but you're also dealing with level 3 now, because they're actually trying to find a way to use this resource for hope. So this sequencing, we have to be prepared for this when we're working with human beings who come from complicated situations. We have to be able to be patient, to not get frustrated, to remain, unconditional in our regard, and to be able to problem solve, not as an individual, but as part of a tribe, part of a team. So you have to know who your resources are around you. So all of this has been my learning in the last 30 years. So let me apply that to these slides now. So we already talked about the decade of the brain and how the use of fMRI studies allowed us to see longitudinally that a kid who was growing up in a challenging home at the age of, 10, 11, 12 would enter school and they're missing gray matter in their brain because parts of the brain weren't stimulated because it's a use it or lose it tool. So we're able to see that there was these missing pieces, this space where there wasn't enough neural networking. Now, the cool thing about the brain is it is very plastic. It's a hard workaround, but we have to think like occupational therapists and like physical therapists. Repetition, 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 working the muscle around the injured muscle. It requires more repetition, which means we have to be able to hang in the pocket. So for me, it means thinking like a coach. What's my starting point? When I engage a human being, how far upstream do I have to go in order to get attention, to get in a conversation with them? And usually what it leads to is what's called an attachment trajectory. People will show you what's of interest to them in the way that they adorn themselves or the way that their houses are set up. They will show you, are you a NASCAR fan? Do you love tattoos? Whatever it happens to be, that is your entry point to ask them about these things so that they can teach you, so that they can begin to operate from a place of mastery or a place of familiarity, something that creates internal motivation in relationship to engaging you. So an attachment trajectory is the idea of first, you being curious about something that matters to them. And then you learning about that over time so that you can ask questions and continue the teaching that they have available to you. Now, what that leads to is they start to look forward to you coming. So now, even when you're not in the room, the cue is when they think about you, they have a sense of safety and connection. Now, you don't even have to be there. And now they know that when they look forward to this interaction. And now there's more motivation to get to that interaction. We do an intervention in residential treatment for kids. It's a 20-session model that was taught to me by my mentors that we used in Gaza and the West Bank. And I was doing the intervention in a residential treatment program for adolescents, and one kid had to leave the program. He went to another program, kind of a step down, that was like 3 or 4 miles away. The kid was 13, probably went about 180 pounds, 5 foot nothing. And he was going to miss the last 2 sessions of this intervention. So we start the session, and I'm honoring the fact that he's not there. And we're telling stories about this kid and how he made us feel. And all of a sudden, the kid busts through the door. He had run 3 miles. He'd run away from his other residential treatment program, run 3 miles in order to get there in time for the session so he could be there, right? So when there's enough connection, there's ability to connect peers and to build group and to understand challenge and the idea of collaborative challenge and doing things together to get the sense and the learning of how to work in collaboration. All of these things are a necessary part of the continuum. So as we learn how the brain gets built and we learn what happens when there's not enough stimulation, we need to understand there are some things. There's organic issues. I'm going to tell you, fetal alcohol is hidden in plain sight. We do not pay enough attention to what fetal alcohol, how it impacts decision-making, understanding consequences, behavior in the brain of, a young preteen or teenager. And yet there's workaround, but the workaround requires relationship and connection and consistency and predictability and the building of enough grit and resilience that they want to engage, which means there's hope, because that's the driver. The driver is the sense of hope that they can experience the world in a different way. And you're providing a template for them. So, decade of the brain, the mapping of the genome, understanding that epigenetics, and I'm a fan of talking about it this way. If you create a safe enough environment for a long enough period of time, you shift the neurochemical release into the bloodstream of a human being. So if it's safe enough and they've challenged the boundaries and they've found that the boundaries that you set for them are safe and consistent and predictable, and they will challenge because they don't trust it until they've challenged it to know it's safe, and that you're going to maintain your boundaries and you're going to maintain consistent, just consequences, then they begin to feel safe in that environment. And it's a different length of time for each person. And so now you have this person who's starting to feel safe, but they don't know what safety is. Their perception of safety is totally different than your perception of safety. And yet safety is at the beginning. If you don't have safety, you can't get to anything else. Because we know from the brain that the brain is built, its primary function is to protect the human being. And it does that mostly by threat detecting, by monitoring the environment for threat so that it can figure out how to adapt. And of course, when you have an unresolved threat, when you have an event where you're overwhelmed, where you're traumatized, the brain is going to become preoccupied. And then the central nervous system is going to get conditioned. And then the physical way you move in the world and the emotional way you move in the world is going to be progressively modified. And before you know it, you're in a prison. You're in a physical, emotional prison. And so the idea of getting to safety first is you have to understand that person's perception of safety, because their perception matters. And way too often we dismiss people's perceptions, we dismiss their stories, we dismiss their lies. And I'm a huge fan of having no emotional reaction when I have a client or a person I'm coaching sitting in front of me who is telling me outlandish lies. It serves no purpose for me until I develop a very robust relationship. So start challenging that at all. When you challenge it, the idea that you don't believe this kid, the kid's actually doing a test or the human being is testing you. They're testing your micro cues. They're testing your vocal tone. They're testing your posture. Will you remain safe? Because I'm telling you this story. Often the real story is much more horrific than the story they're telling you. They're telling you, and I used to do it. I used to lie. I used to lie as a kid all the time. And in lying, I would, try to be esteemed, try to create a place for me in the hierarchy of these human beings. Well, you get found out because your brain's not thinking about the consequences. And now you're shamed because the other kids are, teasing you. So that idea of holding unconditional regard as somebody tells you the stories, that's the entry point for the story to change, for the narrative, the real narrative to begin to emerge. So you have to get to safety first, which means you have to be curious around their perspective of safety. And then you have to understand if that's their perspective of safety, what are we going to do next to begin to shape it towards a different perspective of safety that's going to have more healthier outcomes for them. And so shaping and shading of behavior, the idea of, how do you engage a human being in order to begin the process of them being willing to dare to do something differently when their whole brain has been built in fear and terror around not doing anything differently, rigidity. Okay? So without safety, you can't get to calming. And without calming, you can't begin to diminish judgment of the environment or the human beings you're engaged with. And once calming begins to occur, then it opens the door because you're not judging, you're not suspicious, you're trusting other people's behavior. Now you can begin to actually connect at a deeper level. And with enough repetition of good connection, you start to like the idea of connecting. You like to feel connected. So now you want to practice it. You want to become efficacious. You want to be more connected to yourself. You want to honor taking care of yourself. You want to start to esteem yourself and put yourself in places to be esteemed by others. And when that's rewarded, then hope emerges. The idea that you can now stimulate that part of the left hemisphere that projects into the future and helps you build a rational sequence way about how you're gonna actually exist at the age of 40. When I was 18, I didn't think I was going to make it to 21. And so I operated in that way. I was very impulsive and reactive. And so this idea of the sequencing is super important to understand. This is the one slide that I have always available to me. Because when I get asked about a client, the first thing I want to know is, are they safe? What's their safety? How do I think about their safety and acknowledge that what they perceive as safe is what our starting point is, not what I think is safe. So we get back into, this slide. And for me, the idea that we've set up, understanding that if your family, if your clan, your group of people have experienced significant historical trauma, that's fresh in the DNA. That's fresh in the proteins, as are the survival strategies. And I'm here to tell you, I do not think of oppositional defiance, conduct disorder, anxiety and depression as disorders. I think of them as survival strategies that we either shape as a society into a place where it produces maladaptive behaviors for a human being, or we surround it and nurture and acknowledge it and shape it so that it has pro-social utility in our environment. We have that choice. And our choice, we talk about choices for our clients. if you don't know what you don't know, it's hard for you to make choices about things you don't know. And if you haven't experienced something, and I use this example that I use a lot, if you don't know how to play the piano, then you can't sit down at a piano with sheet music and choose between Bach and Mozart sheet music. You have to learn. Secure attachment is the same way. You have to learn secure attachment. It's coached by a primary caregiver. I'm a huge fan of Bruce Perry's book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, where he talks about this magical caregiver that lives in South Texas who can take any kid under the age of 10 and turn them around behaviorally in a very short period of time. So he's curious. So he goes to visit this caregiver, and the caregiver's talking to him with like a 7-year-old on her lap, and she's rocking this 7-year-old, and just soothing and calming this 7-year-old. And he makes the remark, that's a 7-year-old, right? Why are you rocking them? And the caregiver just fires right back. He's not 7 emotionally. He's, I'm back where he is comforted and where I can grow him from, right? And we have to be okay with that. We have to, honor this journey of this human being who has survived. And now they're trying to figure out how to thrive. They've moved out of victimization. They've moved into survivorship. And now they're seeking a way to thrive in the world. Can we recognize that for what it is? And do we have the tools to begin to walk alongside them as they figure out how to thrive? But we get, complex trauma is a big issue. And for those of you who may not be aware, I'm thinking probably most of you are, but this thing called developmental trauma disorder, which is continuing to emerge as a way that people talk about, what happens to kids and how it impacts and creates gaps in socialization and functioning and affect management and self-perception and all of these things, and the way that can actually open the door to trauma, right? You can actually be taken advantage of and be exploited and be traumatized. I think those important aspects of this understanding, when you come in, we need those protections. And what I hate about our society is the fact that we have, over the last 50 years, isolated young moms and then judged them. So for most of our history as human beings, we've been intact clans, family groups, tribes. A mom was never meant to raise a child on their own. They were supposed to do it in the context of village where auntie, sissy, cousin, grandma, uncle could attune the infant who's in distress and give mom a rest. Allow mom to exist and to be nurtured and taken care of in this group of people that take care of each other, knowing that the child is important to the community and the growth of that child, and that child's nurturing is important. And in the last 40 or 50 years, we fractured even more distance between family members. So now there isn't that robust network of human beings, and there's more judgment on a young mom who makes that choice to have a baby. And you need to pay for that, right? It's your choice, you need to deal with it. Well, as you all know, the community always has to deal with it. It's never in a vacuum. It's never just the mom who has to deal with it. It's an overwhelmed mom who has a child who has these, this generational historical trauma and lives in a challenging home, who, hits the ground running as soon as they, they come into the physical world. So what we know now from the science is, like I was talking about before, that you have this disrupted neurological development. The brain doesn't get stimulated like it should. There's gaps. One of my favorite sayings is, from Rocky 1, where he's being teased about the way he talks, and he says, "Hey, I got gaps." You got gaps, I got gaps, we all got gaps, right? But that idea is, we know from, the ACEs study that a lot of people have gaps, and it's in childhood, and they're not aware of the gaps that they have, and they operate based on their gaps. But then they hit the systems of care where we should be focused on secure attachment. We should be focused on esteem. We should be focused on affect management. We should be focused on nurturing these. And yet, when they get into the school system, we have this expectation that they have these tools, but how do we engage it when they don't? Go to the principal's office, coercion, sit still, right? We use control and we use power in order to suppress behavior in children. Now, for me, this is the most important point of all of this. When you have a child who is loved, who is esteemed, who has consistency and predictability in their home, and has that most important feature, one consistent, predictable, loving adult. When you have that, a child can tolerate consequence of punishment. They can tolerate being grounded. They can tolerate, having their phone taken away. They can tolerate, even corporal punishment. They can tolerate it. The science says very clearly that it doesn't serve a useful purpose, but children who are loved can tolerate it because they exist in a world where when the event is over, they're loved and esteemed, and there's consistency and predictability afterwards. And they have a sense of secure attachment, a sense of self-esteem, and the ability to take other perspective. When you have a child who didn't get those things, they learn totally different lessons. When you have a child who grows up in a home where there is no secure attachment, where they do not have a self-esteem, where they don't have empathy, and then you use power and control to get compliance, to manage their behavior, to suppress their behavior, you have to use higher levels of power and control. And yet, when you apply enough pressure, shame, consequence, control, in order to get compliance, we feel rewarded because we stop the behavior. But what the child has learned, who doesn't have a scaffolding for secure attachment and esteem and empathy, is, oh, this is how you manage relationships. By using power and control in order to get other people to do what you want them to do. So you're stuck in this egocentric brain that is being coached and trained by the way that it's receiving, socialization or anti-socialization, to look at how it engages other human beings. And way too many people extract this method, this scaffolding of using power and control in order to manage relationships. And unless it's resolved, they continue to experience it at higher levels as they move into third grade, fifth grade, puberty, juvenile justice, all of these environments where those tactics continue to be more used in a more sophisticated way. We're training our criminals by the use of this, right? Without acknowledging their need for secure attachment and for empathy and for esteem and for all of these core things. They're building their house on a fractured foundation, which means it's always going to fall apart in the eyes of our society. They're always going to look a little bit different. And that's always going to cue unconscious bias. As you can see on that arrow off to the right, you can see that implicit bias and microaggressions are a constant part of the life of somebody who is perceived as different, right? Now, we can talk about that in the way of minority communities because they live with it all day long in the environment. I know this as a human being whose last name is Grijalva, who spends quite a bit of time in the Midwest. Grijalva when I go into and I give my name, people automatically in the Midwest, they will go, "Oh, Grijalva, is that Finnish? Is that Norwegian?" Because they're looking at me and they want to assign it to, European. And I'm like, "No, that's Hispanic." Now, I have been trained to read microaggressions in three different ways. So as a kid, being hypersensitive to it, to micro cues, as training dolphins, as being in the military and having to be trained to watch people's behavior. So to me, it's fascinating and profound to watch somebody who is engaging you in a very, you know, um, affiliative way. And then you say your heritage is Hispanic, and to watch the shift. No longer there's eye contact. The behavior, the stiffening of certain parts of the body, the shift in vocal tone, all of those things that would cue somebody into a their defensive response. Now, as a human being, do you resonate with it? Are you going to resonate as well? So for me, these things are profound and to understand. But again, when you get exposed to it with enough repetition, it goes into your unconscious, and yet it is still having an impact on your allostatic load. Okay. So allostatic load, the idea that you have so much stress in your life, when you hit a certain level, when your load gets too high, your body starts to talk to you. You start to lose sleep, irritable bowel syndrome, dehydration, headaches, stomach aches. All of these things are your body trying to get your attention, to look inward, to pay attention and to nurture yourself because your system is out of whack. And then that shifts our coping, right? So our coping strategy changes. And if we just think about it in a very normal way, all of a sudden, we're drinking a pot of coffee in the morning. Or, think of 1,000 different other ways that we cope by distraction. And of course, our society is now great at putting distractions in front of us. So as we cope in a way that is superficial and is not connected, because the mechanism for the most functional, optimal coping is to connect to another human being that you can trust and love. And when you experience a situation of grief, that you are surrounded and you are given the opportunity to be nurtured and esteemed by those who love you, and to know that you belong to something larger. And what doesn't happen to our children when they're abused? They don't get access to that optimal healing. They have to figure it out for themselves. And then we wonder why so many human beings are, they can't co-regulate in vulnerability and in intimacy with other human beings. They have to isolate. And you know this because they tell you to leave them alone. Get away from me. They run away. They hide in a corner. They go to their room. They can't co-regulate with other human beings. We built that. So when that occurs, when we don't connect in the deepest way that we're supposed to connect with other human beings, that accelerates our burden of disease, distress, criminalization, and stigmatization. And of course, then that accelerates early death. All right, 3 minutes. What I now know and what I continue to learn, because at the age of almost 68 now, I am still fascinated with what I don't know, and I continue to seek knowledge. So frustration and judgment do not serve me, the client, or the community when working with struggling families. We as a society and as human beings, our scaffolding, we're trained to suppress behavior. The resolution is not in suppression. One of my heroes and mentors, Dr. Rachel Yehuda at the National Institute of Mental Health, I got to sit in the audience it's been about 7 or 8 years ago now. She had designed a blood test where she could take the blood of an adult human being and tell you whether you were physically abused as a child or not. So now her response to that is, as a treating psychiatrist, she doesn't care what you're presenting with as an adult. she's going to go after and help you heal the wound of the childhood physical abuse, because that will stop energizing all of this other behavior and acting out that we have come to call disorders and act accordingly around. So I don't believe, I'm always curious what's underneath the behavior. The behavior, you will talk about behavior all day long in a seminar or in a case study, or when we're, doing a case presentation. After 5 minutes of behavior, I want to know what's driving the behavior. So that's, for that piece that I wanted to make that point. Safety and relationship first, as we've talked about this. Without these, there is no affiliation-based motivation. There's no internal desire to engage. There is no positive internal motivation, right? There's fear-based motivation, but there's a way different learning from fear-based motivation than there is from being in an affiliative mentoring environment. Patience and curiosity always. When I judge, I know it is about me, not the client. I have enough experience in the world now that I don't judge pretty much anything. I don't have any judgment. Coercive program tactics will more often than not produce treatment resistance. How long does it take a human being to learn something good? It takes years. It takes multiple years. And yet, what's our programming? When you think about the idea of, well, here's my program, it's 6 months long. Well, what is the activity that occurs in your program? And then who are you passing the baton to that can take the next piece that this human being? And then how do you fold that person who's going to be taking the next piece into the last couple months of what you're doing, so that the client that you're working with has familiarity and connection, and so that it's a clean handoff to that next person. And then this idea, we're not saviors, we're mentors. And I know way too many foster parents, adoptive parents, people who work in human services in residential treatment programs that think they're saving human beings, that think they're saving kids. And you just can't save somebody from something that's already happened to them. We are mentors. Our job is to walk alongside somebody and, build relationship and tell our story as a learning example as we engage in this new activity with this human being. And internalizing the meeting means that you operate from that perspective. And then align yourself with people who have complementary skill sets for the healing journey. You got to pass the baton. You have to receive the baton. The continuum of care has to be understood and has to have multiple moving parts, because each human being is their own person. And then finding each other's strengths and using them. Okay.